This video will go over cognitive development in early childhood. So specifically, we'll dive into Piaget's preoperational stage, Vygotsky's theory, information processing theory, the Neo-Piagetian theories. We'll also talk about theory and theory of mind. So yeah, lots of different theories in this one. We'll also go into how language develops, early education, and the characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. First off, let's talk about Piaget's preoperational stage. So Piaget noted that this is a time marked by an extraordinary increase in representational or symbolic thinking and activities. The gains in mental representation and the limitations, we'll kind of go over those, bit by bit. But what I wanted to first talk about is, what does preoperational mean? I mean, it sounds like you're getting prepped for surgery, but with Piaget, the term operations refers to logical manipulation of information. So in short, pre-operational just means pre-logical reasoning, pre-logic. So a lot of what children are doing during this stage in terms of problem solving is really relying on their intuition. And this leads to a lot of errors in terms of how they go about solving problems. And again, we'll cover these in more depth over our next few slides here. So Piaget believed that through pretending, young children practice and strengthen newly acquired representational schemes. With age, make-believe play gradually becomes more imaginative and less self-focused. So for imaginative, in early pretending, toddlers will only use realistic objects or objects for realistic pretend. They'll usually imitate adult actions. So for example, children younger than 2, they're fine with pretending to drink from an empty cup, but they will refuse to pretend that that cup is a hat, right? Older children, they can be a bit more imaginative. Gradually, kids will imagine objects and events without any support from the real world at all. In terms of self-focus, children will start to direct their pretend actions toward other objects and people rather than just themselves. Piaget believed that pretend play contributes to both cognitive and social skills, especially as they start developing more complex combination of schemes, as we see in socio-dramatic play. The make-believe play with others that is underway by the end of the second year of life and increases rapidly in complexity during early childhood. Children also display the awareness that make-believe play is a representational activity. They understand that it is pretend. By the end of early childhood, they have a good understanding of role relationships and storylines through, enacting these more elaborate pretend games. The errors, though, that come along with this preoperational stage, one of these is egocentrism. So Piaget's most convincing demonstration of this involves a task called the Three Mountains problem. So each mountain is distinguished by its color, by its summit. So in some iterations, one will have a red cross, a small house, and the third a snow-capped peak. Children at this stage are asked, to describe what they see, to take the other side and describe what they see, and then are asked to describe what a doll would see from their perspective. They always describe, though, what they're seeing, even though they were just over there and could describe what the doll would see if it were real. So they have trouble taking another person's point of view. Another example of this is when they hide, oftentimes they just cover their eyes or they only hide part of themselves and you can see their feet sticking out, things like that. Because the idea is, well, I can't see you, therefore you can't see me. Some other errors, conservation. So conservation refers to understanding that moving or rearranging matter doesn't change the overall quantity. And there are several different tasks that Piaget would put before children to see if they understood this idea. The one that's shown here on the slide is the conservation of liquid task. So it shows a child two glasses with an equal amount of liquid in them. They're asked, do these have the same amount of liquid or does one have more? Children will say they have the same amount. And then in front of the child, they will take one of those glasses, pour it into a taller, narrower glass, and then ask them again, do these two glasses have the same amount or does one have more? And children at the preoperational stage will say, typically, that the taller glass has more liquid. When asked why, their reasoning really kind of boils down to two specific errors, centration and irreversibility. So a lot of the times they'll say, you know, because it's taller, for example, and that demonstrates centration. When you focus on only one aspect of a problem and ignore all others. So they're only focusing, for example, on the height of the liquid and not the shape of the container. The other is irreversibility, being mentally unable to reverse a set of actions, even though they just watched it. So being able to mentally imagine that liquid being poured back into the original glass. So these tasks, they're mastered gradually over the concrete operational stage, which is the next stage of Piaget's cognitive developmental theory. Children in Western nations typically acquire conservation of number, mass, and liquid sometime between 6 and 7 years of age, and conservation of weight sometime between 8 and 10 years of age. Preoperational children also have difficulty with hierarchical classification or the organization of objects into classes and subclasses on the basis of similarities and differences. For example, when children are shown a picture with a bunch or actual buttons, a picture or actual red buttons and one green button, and then are asked, are there more red buttons or buttons? The preoperational child will respond more red buttons, failing to realize that both the red and the green button are included in the more general category of buttons. Animism, another error that preoperational children make. This is when they attribute lifelike qualities to objects. When they think they need to take their teddy bear with them on a trip to the store because they're worried it will get lonely, or trying to feed it, or things like that, right? Attributing those lifelike qualities to non-living objects. This is not to say that Piaget's theory is without criticism. Researchers have challenged Piaget's view of a cognitively deficient preschooler, noting that preschoolers' responses to Piagetian problems often do not reflect their true abilities because the problems contain unfamiliar elements or too many of pieces of information for a young child to handle at one time. For example, in Mexican villages, children of pottery makers will understand conservation of clay much earlier than a child whose parents are not a pottery worker. When researchers use simplified tasks with familiar objects, 3-year-olds will show a clear awareness of others' points of view or vantage points. So these non-egocentric responses will also appear in young children's conversations. Piaget also overestimated preschoolers' animistic beliefs. For example, preschoolers will rarely attribute biological properties like eating and growing to robots. Between 4 and 8 years of age, as children gain familiarity with physical events, their magical beliefs decline. So they can think logically as well in certain circumstances, again, with familiar things. For example, having children answer basic analogies like Play-Doh is to cut up Play-Doh as apple is to, and then given the choices of cut up apple, bitten apple, or cut up loaf of bread, a 3-year-old will correctly choose cut up apple. And in terms of categorization, during their 2nd and 3rd year, they are able to form basic level categories like chairs, tables, and beds. By their 3rd year, they can move back and forth between basic level categories and more general categories like furniture. So again, I mean, Piaget definitely helpful in several aspects, but kind of underestimating children, their abilities do seem to occur earlier than what he believed. Lev Vygotsky believed that children's learning takes place within the zone of proximal development. So remember, with Vygotsky's theory, we have our knowledge base, which is everything we know and all of the things we can do on our own. And then surrounding that, the zone of proximal development, where learning takes place. And that is all of the tasks that we can do if we have help. Right? Too difficult to do alone, possible with the help of adults or more skilled peers. And that help referred to as scaffolding, right? That support. So for example, if a child is learning to tie their shoe, oftentimes that will be incredibly difficult outside of their zone of proximal development as they get a little more mature and are improving in their fine motor skills. It becomes possible with help and will enter their zone of proximal development. We should adjust the amount of scaffolding provided. At first, they will need a lot, but over time, gradually, they'll need less and less scaffolding, and eventually that will become a task that's part of their knowledge base that they can perform all on their own. Children also gradually take the language of their dialogues with adults and make it part of their private speech, which they use to organize their independent efforts. So Vygotsky believed it served a self-directive function. Right, so talking themselves through a task. And we do see children talk to themselves, particularly with more difficult tasks. Effective scaffolding varies among cultures. Unlike Caucasian American parents who often emphasize independence and encourage their children to think of ways to approach a task, Hmong parents who highly value interdependence and child obedience will frequently tell their children what to do. Both Piagetian and Vygotskian early childhood classrooms emphasize active participation of children and an acceptance of individual differences. However, a Vygotskian classroom also promotes assisted discovery. We've got some additional differences as well. So both Vygotsky and Piaget also saw make-believe play as very important too. So the difference is the view of speech. Piaget saw children talking to themselves as egocentric speech, didn't, put a lot of stock in it. Vygotsky, on the other hand, saw private speech as the foundation for all higher order thinking. saw it as very important for teaching. And so what research shows, decades of research shows, Vygotsky is right, speech very valuable for helping children learn. Piaget also emphasized more individual discovery, whereas Vygotsky emphasized the importance of guided discovery and peer collaboration. So getting instruction from more knowledgeable others, getting guidance, getting that scaffolding, as opposed to just working on their own. Information processing's view. Information processing focuses on cognitive operations and mental strategies that children use to transform stimuli flowing into their mental systems. In early childhood, the components of executive function that enable children to succeed in cognitively challenging situations, including attention, impulse control, planning, and memory, show impressive gains. And over the next few slides, we'll talk about different types of attention and memory. A little more details here. So for attention, we have 3 different types. First, divided attention, which sometimes is referred to as multitasking, or the ability to switch one's focus between tasks or stimuli. At 3 to 4 years of age, typically children have difficulty dividing their attention between 2 tasks, similar to that among chimpanzees. We become better than chimpanzees at this by 5 years of age, and will continue to improve to some extent. However, we're not great at dividing our attention, particularly among things that require a lot of it. We only have so much attention. The more you divide it, or the more that is needed for a particular activity, means less for the other one. So it is a limited resource. Selective attention. This is our ability to focus on a single task or stimulus and ignore distracting information. This ability improves with age generally, but is also influenced by temperament, the complexity of the task or stimulus, and whether the stimulus is auditory or visual. Young children are better at visual selection than auditory, so they have more difficulty filtering out background noise than for visually distracting information. And then sustained attention, the ability to stay on task for long periods of time. The younger the child, the shorter their sustained attention span. The stages of memory. So our very first stage of memory, and really we're talking about stages in terms of how long information remains available to us. So with our first stage, we take in sensory information, and this is taken into our sensory memory, or sometimes also referred to as the sensory register. It's where we hold information in its exact form for a very brief period of time. So sights, sounds, for example, maybe maybe somebody's been talking to you and you're pretending like you're listening, but you're not really. And then they call you out on it and they say, "Are you even paying attention? What did I just say?" Your ability to repeat back that last sentence or two that they said is due to your sensory memory. I think we've all been in that position before. Hopefully that's not the case right now. But yeah, so that's our sensory memory. If we're not paying attention to it, that information will be lost. For 2-year-olds, sensory memory is only 1 second long. For 3-year-olds, it's 2 seconds. It starts getting longer than 2 seconds by 4. And then by 6 years of age, it's 3 to 5 seconds long. So it is a very short, period of time. Unless we pay more attention to that information so that it gets into our short-term memory. Short-term memory, also referred to as working memory, It's referred to as short-term memory when we're talking about duration. When we're emphasizing its function, we often call it working memory because it's our cognitive workspace. This is where we're solving problems or studying or having a conversation, right? So we can extend the amount of time we can hold information in short-term memory by rehearsing it, repeating it over and over. If we're not rehearsing that information, it will be lost. With more effort, we can encode that information into long-term memory potentially. Executive function refers to the self-regulatory processes that enable adaptive responses to new situations or to help us reach a particular goal. And these skills emerge gradually, and they require maturation of the prefrontal cortex and experience to continue to develop. Scaffolding a child while they problem solve is very helpful for this. So they can, better use their working memory. Young children also tend not to use memory strategies like rehearsal unless they're reminded to. And often they won't use clustering rehearsal. They won't rehearse previous material while adding in additional information. So having effective encoding and retrieval strategies, very important. So long-term memory, short-term memory, I forgot to continue about that. Short-term memory capacity, it's smaller in young children. So the average 5-year-old can hold 4 digits in their mind, while the average teen and adult can do about 7. However, there is some conflicting research. For the longest time, it was believed that short-term memory capacity for adults was 7 plus or minus 2, meaning you could hold 7 bits of information in your mind at one time, and use that to solve a problem. Or, I mean, that's actually why local phone numbers are 7 digits long. That was done on purpose to make use of short-term memory, so you could remember it long enough for you to dial the number, although obviously not so relevant now. But yes, so more current research has suggested that it might be more like 5 plus or minus 1, or 4 plus or minus 1. So we have seen some conflicting studies on this. It just might be that it's much more variable than previously thought. So long-term memory. Long-term memory thought to not have a capacity limit or a duration limit, so potentially, your entire life. Long-term memory can be broken up into 2 major topics, or 2 major types, I should say, not topics, major types. So long-term broken up into explicit memory, or sometimes also referred to as declarative memory, and implicit memory, sometimes referred to as non-declarative. So let's talk a little bit more about explicit memory, which can be further divided into semantic and episodic. So semantic memory refers, explicit memory. Explicit memory refers to things that we know we can explicitly explain that information. And there are 2 types of those: semantic memory, referring to the meaning of words, so definitions, general knowledge facts falling into that type of memory. Episodic memory, referring to specific events. Related to this is autobiographical memory, which are specific life events of significance, right? So remembering your birthday or your first day of school, or things like that. Implicit memory or non-declarative memory can be divided into priming and procedural memory. So priming refers to readying those associations we have with similar concepts. So for example, if I talked about my dogs, they're two little, I mean, they're fairly little. They're both under 20 pounds. One's like 16, one's like 18 pounds. They're really cute. They're rescues. They're both little mixes, a terrier mix and a chihuahua mix. And then I asked you what the definition of the word bark was. You'd be primed to say it's the sound a dog makes, as opposed to giving the definition of it's the outer covering of a tree, right? So that's what priming is referring to, activating those associations with related concepts. Procedural memory refers to how to do things. So like how to tie your shoe, how to ride a bike, right? Those muscle memories, which can be sometimes hard to explicitly put into detail of, like, how do you ride a bike? Well, I have to flex my muscles in just this right way. I have to maintain my balance. I have to pedal, right? It's a little hard to, completely list that out in explicit detail. So it falls under implicit. And different parts of the brain uh, correlate with these different types of memories. So for example, we talked about the hippocampus before, and it being immature as one of the reasons potentially why we have infantile amnesia. The hippocampus, for transferring information from short-term memory to long-term memory, particularly for explicit memory. Okay, so for children, in terms of autobiographical memory, fragments at 2 years of age, and they'll be able to form more detailed autobiographical memories over the next few years. Theory of mind. As children try to understand the world around them, they tend to explain everything they encounter, and that refers to theory, right? I have a theory about this. I have a theory about that. Ask them how something works. It's you get some really creative explanations sometimes. Theory of mind refers to the ability to think about other people's thoughts. And this is often tested with a false belief task. Excuse me. And that's shown here on the slide. So it shows Sally and Anne, Sally's basket, Anne's box. Sally puts her red ball into her basket. Sally leaves the room, and Anne is alone. Anne takes the ball out of the basket, puts it into the box. When Sally comes back, where will Sally look for her ball? 3-year-olds will often struggle with this task. They will say Sally will look in the box because they can't separate what they know is true and what someone else might think is true. Right? 4 or 5-year-olds, they can successfully complete the false belief task, just like us adults can, right? When she comes back, Sally's going to look in the basket because that's where she left it. She doesn't know Anne moved it, right? So it's often not until middle childhood that kids understand that people may hide how they feel. And this has led several researchers to say theory of mind is actually composed of several different components. So diverse desires, understanding that two people may have different desires regarding the same object. One may want it, like it, one may not. Diverse beliefs, understanding two people may hold different beliefs about an object. Knowledge access, understanding people may or may not have access to that information. And then false belief, understanding someone might hold a belief based on false information. Children in the United States, Australia, and Germany develop theory of mind in the sequence shown, while children in China and Iran develop knowledge access before diverse beliefs. And this is thought to be due to collectivistic culture's emphasis on conformity to family and cultural values, having greater respect for elders, and the acquisition of knowledge and academic skills more than autonomy and social skills. So this may decrease the number of family conflicts, but will change up the order of how those aspects of theory of mind develop. In individualistic cultures, children are encouraged to express themselves and their opinions, and that can lead to an increase in family conflicts. In terms of language, vocabulary growth between the ages of 2 and 6 is so impressive. So at 2 years of age, most children have a vocabulary of around 200 words. By 6 years of age, they have around 10,000 words that they know. They'll hit this vocabulary spur of 10 to 20 new words per week through fast mapping, where words are easily learned by making connections between new words and concepts that are already known. Children do not have a complete understanding of words, especially of expressions and figures of speech. For example, saying something like time flies or it's raining cats and dogs outside. Young children will often take this quite literally and be like, where are the cats and dogs? Literally had my one of my nephews ask me, because I said it's raining cats and dogs outside, just meaning it's raining a lot. He took it very literally. He's 4, so right at that age. Children begin to learn grammar rules, but they may overextend the rules to words that are exceptions, an error called overregularization. So for example, they might say, my toy car braked instead of broke, or we each have 2 foots instead of feet. In early childhood, conversational give and take with adults is consistently related to language progress. Adults generally provide feedback about grammar by using recasts and expansions. Recasts are these gentle corrections. So if they said like, we each have 2 foots, sorry, I can't even say it wrong. We each have 2 foots. We'd say, yes, you do have 2 feet. And an expansion would be then building on that. How many feet does so-and-so have? How many feet does the dog have, right? So they get a little more practice with that, a little more information. The majority of children in the world are bilingual or multilingual. In the United States, 21% speak a language other than English at home, so roughly 1 in 5. Learning more than one language in childhood typically leads to benefits in executive function skills like inhibitory control and working memory, and leads to greater efficiency in the word learning process. Monolingual children are strongly influenced by the mutual exclusivity bias, the assumption that an object has only a single name. So they can get confused when the same object is referred to by different names. For example, car may also be called automobile or a sedan. Monolingual children often find it easier to learn the name of a new object than to learn a new name for a previously learned object. Bilingual children show little difficulty with either task. So getting into autism spectrum disorder. So autism spectrum disorder fits in well here, not only in terms of the age group where we can typically start seeing signs of autism spectrum disorder, if not even earlier, but also in that there are commonly issues with communication, with theory of mind, so having difficulty taking another person's point of view, that lead to struggles. So those symptoms, deficits in social interaction, again, things like theory of mind tend to be a struggle. Communication, doing things like understanding someone else's feelings, not taking things too literally, having difficulty understanding sarcasm, things like that are very common. Another major symptom is having restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, restricted interests or activities. Autism spectrum disorder is a spectrum. The diagnosis was previously separated into autism and Asperger's disorder, but with more research, it was decided that those diagnoses should be combined into autism spectrum disorder. So we don't technically have the diagnosis Asperger's anymore, or pervasive developmental disorder. Those have all been combined into autism spectrum disorder. Um, and really what because of the similarities of the symptoms, but there's a lot of variation, particularly in terms of the severity level. So the highest severity level is a 3, meaning that an individual requires very substantial support, a 2, substantial support, or a 1, requiring support. So 1 is the mildest level of severity. In the United States, about 1 in 59 children are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and that's about 1.7%. About 4 times more boys are about 4 times more often diagnosed than girls. There has been some concern about whether this is accurate. Is it just more that boys are more likely to be screened for it, or that their symptoms are more noticeable compared to girls, or is it really that big of a difference between the sexes? So that's more research is being done into that area. The increase in diagnoses, that's thought to be due to the broadening of the diagnosis. As I said, we combined autism with Asperger's, with pervasive developmental disorder, and some other similar disorders, essentially, to follow along this spectrum. And so that has increased the number of diagnoses, as have increased efforts to identify cases. So things like early screenings, and part of that has been driven by a greater awareness and acceptance of the diagnosis. So as opposed to parents maybe shrugging it off, being concerned about the stigma, recognizing this is a disorder, and that support is available, help is available to address symptoms. The exact causes of autism spectrum disorder are unknown, but genetics plays a big role. There is a 60 to 90% concordance rate for identical twins compared to fraternal twins and siblings. And concordance rates, so remember, identical twins share 100% of their DNA roughly, compared to fraternal twins and full biological siblings, which only share about half of their DNA, right? So with concordance rates, that refers to when one twin gets diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, how often does the other twin? And again, for identical twins, it's 60 to 90% of the time that other twin will get a diagnosis as well. For fraternal twins and full biological siblings, it's only 5 to 10% concordance. So if one is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, there's only a 5 to 10% chance the other twin or the other sibling will be diagnosed as well. So much lower, which suggests that, yes, genetics is playing quite a big role there. Because it's not 100%, however, we know genetics is not the only factor. So some of the environmental risk factors we know about: pollutant exposure. So things like air pollution, if you're living in an urban versus rural residence, do you have a vitamin D deficiency? Another significant environmental risk factor: infection during pregnancy. And this actually increases risk 79%. So infections like sepsis, influenza, pneumonia, meningitis, things like that. And that's one of the reasons why it's strongly recommended that pregnant individuals get like their flu vaccine. We do have various vaccines for a lot of these infections to prevent them, and which in turn will reduce likelihood of autism. Talking about vaccines, there is no scientific evidence linking autism and vaccinations. The paper put out by Andrew Wakefield was retracted after a 7-year-long investigation found that he had falsified his data, that he was receiving money from a lawyer working to sue a vaccine company, who basically said they needed evidence. his study also is just kind of problematic in a lot of other ways as well. Very small sample size. I think it was only 12 or 13 children that he got information from their parents, took blood samples from them at a birthday party. Um, yeah. Yeah, so again, various problems with that. So his paper got retracted. Um, he lost his license to practice medicine because if you're a doctor and you falsify your results, then it leads to increases in public health problems like the resurgence of a lot of diseases that we have vaccines for, like measles. Um, yeah, that's bad. They took away his medical license. He can't practice medicine anymore. So there are other reasons why people might choose not to vaccinate, but um, in terms of is there a link to autism? No, no credible research finding a link between autism and vaccination. And so that wrapped up our cognitive developmental section.